The natives had sufficient confidence. The natives had sufficient confidence. When the captain landed, he was received with joyful demonstrations, and with the surprise natural to people who are brought face to face with objects of which they have had no previous idea. Some of the chiefs, enjoining silence, made short harangues, and Cook began the usual distribution of ironmongery and hardware. His officers mixed with the crowd to make observations. Many of the natives appeared afflicted with a kind of leprosy, and their arms and legs were greatly swollen. They were all but naked, wearing merely a cord tightened to the figure, from which hung scraps of stuff made from the fig tree. A few wore enormous cylindrical hats, open on two sides, like the hats of the Hungarian hussars. They hung tortoise-shell earrings or rolls of the leaves of the sugar-cane in their ears, which were pulled out and split. The English soon perceived a little village above the mangroves which bordered the shore. It was surrounded by sugarcane plantations, yams, and banana trees, and watered by little canals, cleverly diverted from the large river. Cook soon discovered that he need expect nothing of this race but permission to survey the country. These natives, he says, taught us a few words of their language, which bore no resemblance to that of any other tribe. They were mild and peaceable in character, but extremely lazy. If we addressed them, they replied, but if we continued our way, seldom joined us in our excursions. If we passed their cabins without remark, they took no notice of us. The women were slightly more curious, and hid themselves in the bushes to look after us, but they would only approach in the company of the men. They appeared neither vexed nor alarmed when we shot birds. Indeed, if we were near their huts, the young people would point them out to us, for the pleasure of seeing us fire. They appeared to have very little to do at this time of year. Having tilled the ground and sown roots and bananas, they awaited their crops next summer. Perhaps in this fact lay the explanation of their having no provisions to offer in traffic, for in other respects, we found them fully alive to the hospitable instinct, which more particularly commends the islanders of the southern seas to navigators. Cook's assertion of the indolence of the New Caledonians is perfectly true, but his stay amongst them was too short to enable him to appreciate their character thoroughly, and he certainly never suspected that they indulged in the horrible practice of cannibalism. He noticed no birds living in a wild state there excepting quails, turtle doves, pigeons, turkeys, ducks, teal, and a few smaller ones. He could not ascertain the presence of any quadrupeds, and he entirely failed in his endeavors to procure provisions. At Balade the captain made several excursions into the interior, and climbed the mountains to gain a general view over the country. From the summit of a rock, he clearly saw the two coasts, and ascertained that New Caledonia in this part was only 10 leagues in width. In its general features, the country resembled various portions of New Holland, which is in the same latitude. The productions of both appear to be the same, and there is an absence of brushwood in the forests of both. Cook also observed the presence of minerals on the hills, and his discovery has been verified in late years by the proved existence of gold, iron, copper, coal, and nickel. A few of the crew met with a similar adventure, here to that which had been almost fatal to some of them, in the neighborhood of Malicolo. Cook relates it thus: "My secretary bought a fish which had been harpooned by a native, and sent it to me on board. This fish was of an entirely new species, and resembled that known as sunfish. It was of the order called Tetrodon by Lin O's. Its head was hideous, wide, and long. Never suspecting that it might be poisonous, I ordered it to be served at table the same evening. Fortunately, so much time was consumed in drawing and describing it that no time was left for the cooking, and only the liver was served. The two Forsters and myself partook of it, and towards 3 in the morning we experienced a sensation of weakness and want of power in our limbs. I all but lost the sense of touch, and could no longer distinguish light from heavy objects when I desired to move them. A pot full of water and a feather appeared to me equally heavy. We first resorted to emetics, and afterwards we succeeded in inducing perspiration, which relieved us greatly. In the morning, a pig which had eaten the entrails of the fish was found dead. When the natives came on board and saw the fish hanging up, they made us understand that it was unwholesome. They showed their disgust of it, but neither in selling it, or even after having been paid for it, had they given the slightest hint of such aversion. Cook next proceeded to the survey of the greater part of the eastern coast. During this excursion he met with a native as white as a European. His complexion was attributed to illness. This man was an albino, like those already met with in Tahiti and the Society Islands. The captain was anxious to acclimatize pigs in New Caledonia, but he had the greatest difficulty in inducing the natives to accept a hog and a sow. He was forced to insist upon their usefulness, the facility of breeding them, and to exaggerate their value before the natives would consent to their being landed. Cook describes the New Caledonians as tall, robust, active, polite, and peaceable. He gives them the rare character of honesty. But his successors in this country, more especially 500 Entrecasto, discovered to their detriment that they did not preserve this quality. Some of them had the thick lips, flat nose, and general appearance of the Negro. Their naturally curly hair added to the resemblance. If I were to guess, says Cook, at the origin of this people, I should take them to be an intermediate race between the people of Tanna and the Friendly Islands, or between those of Tanna and New Zealand, or possibly between all three, for their language is in some respects a sort of mixture of that of these different countries. The frequency of war amongst them is indicated by the number of their offensive weapons: clubs, spears, lances, slings, javelins, and see, the stones used for their slings are smooth and oval. Their houses are built on a circular plan, most of them being like beehives with the roof of considerable height and terminating in a point. They always have one or two fires alight, but as there is only one outlet for the smoke, through the doorway, no European could live in them. With the roof of considerable height, with the roof of considerable height, they subsisted entirely upon fish and roots, such as yams and the bark of a tree, which was but little succulent. Bananas, sugar canes, and breadfruit were rare, and coconuts did not flourish so well as in the island previously visited by the English. The number of inhabitants appeared considerable, but Cook justly remarked that his arrival had brought about a general reunion of all the tribes, and Lieutenant Pickersgill decided during his hydrographical excursions that the country was sparsely populated. The New Caledonians buried their dead. Many of the crew visited their cemeteries, and especially the tomb of a chief, which was a kind of mound, decorated with spears, javelins, arrows, and darts, which were stuck around it. Cook left the harbor of Balade and continued to coast New Caledonia without finding fresh provisions. The aspect of the country was universally sterile, but quite to the south of this large land, a smaller one was discovered, to which the name of Pine Island was given, on account of the number of pine trees upon it. They were a species of Prussian pine, very appropriate for the spars needed for the Resolution. Cook accordingly sent a sloop and some men to choose and cut the trees he needed. Some of them were 20 inches in diameter and 70 feet high, so that a mast could have been formed of one had it been needed. The discovery of this island had a certain value, as, with the exception of New Zealand, it was the only one in the entire Pacific Ocean which produced wood fit for masts and poles. In steering southwards towards New Zealand, Cook sighted a small, uninhabited island on the 10th of October, upon which the botanists reaped a plentiful harvest of unknown vegetables. It was Norfolk Island, so named in honor of the Howard family. It was afterwards colonized by a part of the mutineers of the Bounty. The Resolution anchored again in Queen Charlotte's Sound. The gardens so anxiously planted by the English had been entirely neglected by the New Zealanders, but in spite of this several plants had grown marvelously. The natives were very shy of appearing at first, and seemed to care little for any intercourse with the strangers, but when they recognized their old friends, they testified their delight most extravagantly. When asked why they had been so reserved at first, they evaded a reply, and there was no doubt that they were thinking of murder and combats. This aroused Cook's apprehensions for the fate of the Adventure, of which he had heard nothing since his last stay in this port, but he could obtain no reply to the questions he put. He was only to learn what had occurred in his absence, when he reached the Cape of Good Hope and found letters from Captain Furneaux. After once more landing some pigs, with which he wished to endow New Zealand, the captain set sail for Cape Horn on the 10th of November. After a vain cruise, he at last sighted the eastern shore of Tierra del Fuego, near the entrance to the Straits of Magellan. The portion of America which now met our view, says Cook, was dreary enough. It seemed to be cut up into small islands, which, though by no means high, were very black and almost entirely barren. In the background we saw high ground covered with snow, almost to the water's edge. It is the wildest shore I have ever seen, and appears entirely composed of mountains and rocks without a vestige of vegetation. The mountains overhang horrible precipices, the sharp peaks of which arise to great height. Probably there is nothing in nature which presents so wild an appearance. The interior mountains are covered with snow, but those bordering the sea are not. We imagine the former to belong to Tierra del Fuego, and the latter to be ranged over the small islands in such a way as to present the appearance of an uninterrupted coast. The captain still thought it better to remain some time in this desolate region to procure fresh victuals for his crew. He found safe anchorage in Christmas Sound, where, as usual, he made a careful hydrographical survey. View of Christmas Sound. View of Christmas Sound. Several birds were shot, and Mr. Pickerskill brought 300 seagulls' eggs and 14 geese on board. I was thus enabled, says Cook, to distribute them to the entire crew, a fact which gave the greater satisfaction as it was near Christmas. Without this timely supply, they must have contented themselves with beef and salt pork. Some of the natives, belonging to the nation called Pecherais by Bougainville, came on board without any pressing. Cook's description of these savages recalls that of the French explorer. They preferred the oily portions of the flesh of the seals upon which they lived, a taste which Cook attributed to the fact that the oil warmed their blood and enabled them to resist the intense cold. If, he adds, the superiority of a civilized to a savage life could ever be called in question, a single glance at one of these Indians would be sufficient to settle the question. Until it is proved that a man perpetually tortured by the rigor of a climate is happy, I shall never give in to the eloquent declamations of those philosophers who have never had the opportunity of observing human nature in all its phases, or who have not felt what they have seen. The Resolution at once set sail and doubled Cape Horn. The Strait of Le Maire was then crossed, and Staten Island reconnoitered. Here a good anchorage was found. Quantities of whales abound in these latitudes. It was now their pairing season, and seals and sea lions, penguins and garnets appeared in shoals. Dr. Sparman and myself, says Forster, narrowly escaped being attacked by one of these sea monsters, upon a rock where several of them were assembled, appearing to wait the upshot of the struggle. The doctor had fired at a bird and stooped to pick it up when the sea lion growled and, showing his tusks, seemed disposed to attack my companion. From where I was posted, I shot the animal stark dead, and at the report of my gun the herd, seeing their companion fall, fled along the coast. Several of them threw themselves into the sea with such haste that they jumped 10 or 15 roods straight upon the pointed rocks. But I do not think they hurt themselves much, for their skin is very hard and their fat is so elastic that it is easily compressed. After leaving Staten Island, Cook set sail on the 3rd of January, for the southeast, to explore the only part of the ocean which had hitherto escaped him. He soon reached southern Georgia, seen in 1675 by Laroche, and again by M. Guillaume Duclos in 1756, when in command of the Spanish vessel the Leon. This discovery was made on the 14th of January, 1775. The captain landed in 3 places and took possession in the name of King George Roman III of England, bestowing his name upon the newly found country. Possession Bay is bordered by pointed rocks of ice, exactly similar to those which had been met with in the high southern latitudes. The interior of the country, says the narrative, is no less savage and frightful. The summits of the rocks are lost in the clouds, and the valleys are covered with perpetual snow. Not a tree or even the smallest shrub is to be seen. After leaving Georgia, Cook penetrated further to the southeast, amidst floating ice. The continual dangers of the voyage overcame the crew. Southern Thule, Saunders Island, and Chandeleur Islands, and finally Sandwich Land were discovered. These sterile and deserted archipelagos have no value for the merchant or geographer. Once certain of their existence, it was unnecessary to remain, for to do so was to risk in exploring them the valuable records the Resolution was taking to England. Cook was convinced by the discovery of these isolated islands that near the pole there is a stretch of land, where the greater part of the floating ice spread over this vast southern ocean is formed. This ingenious theory has been confirmed in every particular by the explorers of the 19th century. After another fruitless search for Cape Circumcision, mentioned by Bouvet, Cook decided to regain the Cape of Good Hope, and he arrived there on the 22nd of March, 1775. The Adventure had put into this port, where Captain Furneaux had left a letter relating all that had happened in New Zealand. Captain Furneaux arrived in Queen Charlotte's Sound on the 13th of November, 1773, and took in wood and water. He then sent one of his boats under Lieutenant Rowe to gather edible plants. As the lieutenant did not return on board either in the evening or the next morning, Captain Furneaux, feeling sure that an accident had happened, sent in search of him. The following is a short account of what he learned. After various useless searchings, the officer in command of the sloop came upon some traces, as he landed upon the shore near Grass Creek. Portions of a boat and some shoes, one of which had belonged to an officer of the watch, were found. A sailor, at the same time, noticed a piece of fresh meat, which was taken to be the flesh of a dog, for it was not known then that the people of the place were cannibals. We opened, says Furneaux, about 8 baskets which we found on the beach tightly corded. Some were full of roast flesh and others of roots used by the natives for bread. Continuing our search, we found more shoes and a hand which we recognized as that of Thomas Hill because TH was tattooed upon it in the Tahitan fashion. At a short distance, an officer perceived 4 pirogues and a number of natives, assembled round a large fire. The English landed and fired a regular volley, which put the Zealanders to flight, with the exception of 2, who left with the greatest sang-froid. One of them was severely wounded, and the sailors advanced up the beach. A frightful scene was soon presented before our eyes. We saw the heads, hearts, and lungs of many of the crew upon the sands, and at a little distance dogs were devouring the entrails. The officer had not a sufficient force with him, being backed by only 10 men, to meet this fearful massacre with fitting vengeance. The weather, too, became bad, and the savages collected in large numbers. It was necessary to regain the adventure. I do not believe, says Captain Furneaux, that this butchery was premeditated on the part of the natives, for in the morning Mr. Rowe said that he observed 2 vessels pass us, and remain all the forenoon in sight of the ship. The bloodshed was most likely the result of a quarrel which was instantly fought out, or possibly as our men took no measures for their own safety, their want of caution tempted the Indians. The natives, having heard one discharge, were encouraged by observing that a gun was not an infallible instrument, that it sometimes missed fire, and that once fired it was necessary to reload before firing again. In this fearful ambuscade, the Adventure lost 10 of her best sailors. Furneaux left New Zealand on the 23rd of December, 1773, doubled Cape Horn, put into the Cape of Good Hope, and reached England on the 14th of July, 1774. After Cook had taken in provisions and repaired his vessel, he left False Bay on the 27th of May, put into St. Helena, Ascension Island, and Fernando de Noronha at Fale, one of the Azores, and finally at Plymouth on the 29th of July, 1775. During his voyage of 3 years and 18 days, he had only lost 4 men, that is to say, without reckoning the 10 sailors who were massacred at New Zealand. No former expedition had reaped such a harvest of discoveries and hydrographical, physical, and ethnological observations. The learned and ingenious investigations pursued by Cook elucidated many of the difficulties of earlier navigators. He made various important discoveries, amongst others, that of New Caledonia and Easter Island. The non-existence of an Antarctic continent was definitely ascertained. The great navigator received the fitting reward of his labors almost immediately. He was nominated ship's captain 9 days after his landing, and was elected a member of the Royal Society of London on the 29th of February, 1776. Chapter 5. Captain Cook's Third Voyage. 1. Search for the lands discovered by the French, Kerguelen Islands, stay at Van Diemen's Land, Queen Charlotte's Strait, Palmerston Island, grand rejoicings in the Tonga Islands. At this date, the idea which had sent so many explorers to Greenland was in full force. The question of the existence of a northern passage between the Atlantic and the Pacific, by way of the Asiatic or American coasts, was eagerly discussed. And should such a passage exist, was it practicable for ships? The attempt had quite lately been made to discover this outlet in Hudson or Baffin Bays, and it was now determined to seek it in the Pacific. The task was an arduous one. The Lords of the Admiralty felt that it was essential to send out a navigator who had experience of the dangers of the polar seas, and one who had shown presence of mind in the face of danger. One, moreover, whose talents, experience, and scientific knowledge might be of use in the powerful equipment then in course of preparation. In Captain Cook alone were all the requisite qualities to be found. The command was offered to him, and although he might have passed the remainder of his days in peace at his post in the Greenwich Observatory, in the full enjoyment of the honor and glory he had gained by his 2 voyages round the world, he did not hesitate for a moment. 2 ships, the Resolution and the Discovery, were placed under his command. The latter was under the orders of Captain Clerke, and the equipment of both was similar to that of the last expedition. The instructions given to the commander of the expedition enjoined his reaching the Cape of Good Hope and steering south in search of the islands recently discovered by the French, in 48 degrees of latitude, towards the meridian of the island of Mauritius. He was then to touch at New Zealand, if he thought well, to take in refreshments at the Society Islands, and to land the Tahitian Mai there. Then to proceed to New Albion, to avoid landing in any of the Spanish possessions in America, and from thence to make his way by the Arctic Ocean to Hudson and Baffin Bays. In other words, he was to look in an easterly direction for the Northwest Passage. This once effected, after a stay at Kamchatka, he was to make another attempt to reach England by the route he might judge most productive of good results for geography and navigation. The two vessels did not start together. The Resolution set sail from Plymouth on the 12th of July, 1776, and was rejoined at the Cape by the Discovery on the 10th of the following November, she having left England only on the 1st of August. The two ships were detained at the Cape until the 30th of November by the repairs needed by the Discovery. Much damaged by tempest, she required calking. The captain profited by this long delay to buy live stock, which he intended to land at Tahiti and New Zealand, and also to stock his vessels with the necessary stores for a 2 years' voyage. After steering southwards for 12 days, two islands were discovered in 46 degrees 53 south latitude and degrees 46 east longitude. The strait which separates them was crossed, and it was found that their steep sterile coasts were uninhabited. They had been discovered with four others, from 9 to 12 degrees further east, by the French captains Marion Dufresne and Crozet in 1772. On the 24th of December, Cook found the islands which M. de Kerguelen had surveyed in his two voyages of 1772, 1773. Kerguelen Islands. Kerguelen Islands. We will not here relate the observations made by Cook upon this group. As they agree in every particular with those of M. de Kerguelen, we can reserve them until we relate the adventures of that navigator, and content ourselves with remarking that Cook surveyed the coasts carefully, and left them on the 31st of December. The vessels were enveloped in a thick fog, which accompanied them for more than 300 leagues. Anchor was cast in Adventure Bay, in Van Diemen's Land, on the 26th of January. It was the same spot at which Captain Furneaux had touched 4 years earlier. The English were visited by a few natives, who received the presents offered to them, without showing any satisfaction. The narrative says, "They were of ordinary height, but rather slightly built. Their skin was black and their hair of the same color, and as woolly as that of the Negroes of New Guinea, but they had not the thick lips or flat noses of African Negroes. There was nothing disagreeable in their features, and their eyes struck us as beautiful, so did their teeth, but they were very dirty. Most of them anointed their hair and beards with a yellow ointment, and some even rubbed their faces with the same stuff." Concise as this account is, it is not the less valuable. The race of Tasmanians is extinct, the last of them died a few years ago. Cook weighed anchor on the 30th of January, and took up his station at his usual point in Queen Charlotte Strait. The vessels were soon surrounded by pirogues, but not a single native ventured to go on board. They were so fully persuaded that the English had come to avenge their murdered comrades. Once convinced that the English had no such intention, they banished their mistrust and reserve. The captain soon found out by Mai's interpretation, he understanding the Zealand tongue, the right cause of this terrible catastrophe. It appeared that the English had been seated on the grass, taking their evening meal when the natives committed several thefts. One of them was caught and struck by a sailor. At his cry, his companions rushed upon the sailors of the Adventure, who killed 2 of them, but unfortunately succumbed to numbers. Several of the Zealanders pointed out to Cook the chief who had directed the carnage, and urged Cook to kill him. But to the great surprise of the natives and the stupefaction of Mai, the captain refused. Mai remarked, "In England they kill a man who assassinates another. This fellow killed 10, and you take no revenge." Before he left, Cook landed pigs and goats, hoping that these animals might at length become acclimatized to New Zealand. Mai had a wish to take a New Zealander to Tahiti. 2 offered to go, and Cook agreed to receive them, warning them at the same time that they would never see their native land again. But no sooner had the vessels lost sight of the shores of New Zealand than they began to weep. Seasickness added to their distress. But as they recovered from it, their sadness disappeared, and they soon attached themselves to their new friends. An island named Mangia was discovered on the 29th of March. At Mai's representations, the inhabitants decided to come on board. Small, but vigorous and well-proportioned, they wore their hair knotted upon the top of the head. They wore long beards and were tattooed in all parts of their bodies. Cook could not carry out his earnest wish to land, as the people were too hostile. A new island, similar to the last, was discovered 4 leagues further on. The natives appeared more friendly than those of Mangia, and Cook profited by this fact and landed a detachment under Lieutenant Gore, with Mai as interpreter. Anderson, the naturalist, an officer named Barnes, and Mai landed alone and unarmed, running the risk of being maltreated. They were received with solemnity and conducted through a crowd of men, with clubs on their shoulders, to the presence of 3 chiefs, whose ears were adorned with red feathers. They soon perceived a score of women, who danced in a grave and serious fashion, paying no attention to their arrival. The officers were separated from each other, and observing that the natives hastened to empty their pockets, they began to entertain fears for their safety when Mai reappeared. They were detained all day and forced several times to take their clothes off and allow the natives to examine the color of their skin, but night arrived at last without the occurrence of any disagreeable incident. The visitors regained their sloop, and coconuts, bananas, and other provisions were brought to them. The English may have owed their safety to the description Mai had given of the power of their weapons, and the experiment he made before them of setting fire to a cartridge. Mai had recognized 3 of his fellow countrymen in the crowd on the beach. These Tahitans had started in a pirogue to reach Ulaidia Island and had been driven out of their course by contrary winds. As they expected a short voyage, they had not provided themselves with food. Famine and fatigue had reduced their number to 4 men, all of them half dead, when the pirogue capsized. The unfortunate wretches managed to seize the side of their boat and support themselves in the water until they were picked up by the inhabitants of this island, Wateroo. It was now 12 years since fate threw them upon this shore, more than 200 leagues from their native island. They had contracted family ties and friendly alliances with these people, whose manners and language were not unlike their own. They refused to return to Tahiti. Cook says, "We may find in this incident a better explanation of the way in which detached portions of the globe, and particularly the islands of the Pacific, have been peopled than in any theories, especially in regard to those which are far from any other continent and at a great distance from each other." Wateroo Island is situated in 20 degrees 1 south latitude and degrees 45 east longitude. The 2 vessels afterwards reached a neighboring island called Wenua, upon which M. Gore landed to get fodder. Although the ruins of houses and tents were seen, it was uninhabited. On the 5th of April, Cook arrived in sight of Harvey Island, which he had discovered during his second voyage in 1773. At that time, it appeared to him deserted. He was, therefore, astonished to see several pirogues leave the shore and approach the ships, but the natives could not find courage to go on board. Their fierce appearance and noisy offers did not promise well for their friendly intentions. Their language was still more like that of Tahiti than that of the last islands they had visited. Lieutenant King was sent in search of good anchorage, but could not succeed in finding a suitable harbor. The natives, armed with spears and clubs, appeared disposed to resent any attempt at landing. Cook, in his great need of wood and water, determined to reach the friendly islands. He was sure of finding refreshments for his men and forage for his beasts there. The season was too far advanced, and the distance between these latitudes and the pole too great to allow of anything being attempted in the southern hemisphere. The wind obliged him to relinquish his idea of reaching Middleburg or Ia, as he had at first intended. He therefore directed his course towards Palmerston Island, where he arrived on the 14th of April, and where he found birds in abundance, scurvy grass, and coconuts. This island was merely a collection of 9 or 10 islets, very slightly raised, appearing almost like the points of reefs, belonging to one coral bank. The English reached Camango Island on the 28th of April, and the natives brought them quantities of coconuts, bananas, and other stores. They then proceeded to Anamuka, which is also part of the Tonga, or Friendly Archipelago. On the 6th of May, a chief of Tonga Tabu, named Fainiao, visited Cook. He called himself king of all the Friendly Islands. "I received," says Cook, "a present from this great personage of 2 fish, which were brought to me by one of his servants. I paid him a visit after dinner. He came to meet me as soon as he saw me land. He appeared some 30 years of age, tall and of slender form, and I have met no countenance in these islands so European in type." When all the provisions of this island were exhausted, Cook visited a group of islets called Happy, where his reception was friendly, owing to the orders given by Fainiao, and where he procured pigs, water, fruits, and roots. Some of the native warriors exhibited their skill in various singular combats, with clubs and boxing. What most surprised us, says the narrative, was to see two great women enter the lists and attack each other with their fists without the least ceremony and with as much skill as the men. Their fight lasted about half a minute when one of them declared herself beaten. The victorious heroine received as much applause from the assembled multitude as is usually accorded to a man who has overcome his rival by his skill and address. There was no cessation of the fetes and games. A dance was executed to the sound of two drums, or rather of two hollow trunks, by 105 performers, supported by a vocal choir. Cook reciprocated these demonstrations by putting his soldiers through their artillery exercises and letting off fireworks, which produced indescribable astonishment in the minds of the natives. Not wishing to be outdone in the attempt at display, the natives gave a concert, and then a dance, executed by 20 women crowned with China roses. This magnificent ballet was followed by another performance by 15 men, but we shall never end if we attempt to give an account of the wonders of this enthusiastic reception. It justly gained for the Tonga archipelago the name of Friendly Islands. On the 23rd, Fine Yao, who had represented himself as king of the entire archipelago, came to inform Cook of his departure for the neighboring island of Vaviao. He had excellent reasons for this, as he had just heard of the arrival of the real sovereign, named Fudafe or Pulaho. Cook at first refused to recognize the newcomer in this character, but he soon had irrefutable proof that the title of king belonged to him. Pulaho was extremely stout, which with his short height made him look like a barrel. If rank is proportioned to size in these islands, he was without exception the greatest chief the English had met with. Intelligent, grave, and dignified, he examined the vessel and everything that was new to him in detail, put judicious questions, and inquired into the motives of the arrival of these vessels. His followers objected to his descending below decks, saying it was taboo, and that it was not allowed for anyone to walk over his head. Cook, however, promised through the interpreter Mai that no one should be allowed to walk over his cabin, and so Pulaho dined with the captain. He ate little and drank still less, and invited Cook to land with him. The marks of respect lavished upon Pulaho by all the natives convinced Cook that he had been entertaining the real sovereign of the archipelago. On the 29th of May, Cook set sail on his return to Anamoka, thence to Tonga Tabu, where a feast or kiva, more magnificent than any he had seen, was given in his honor. In the evening, he said, we had the spectacle of a bomai, that is to say, the dances of the night were performed in front of Fainiao's house. We saw 12 dances during the time. They were executed by women, and in the midst of them we noticed the arrival of a number of men, who formed a ring within that of the dancing women. 24 men, who executed a third, made a movement with the hands, which was greatly applauded, and which we had not previously seen. The orchestra was renewed once. Fine Yao appeared upon the scene at the head of 50 dancers, most magnificently apparelled. His garment consisted of cloth and a large piece of gauze, and round his neck small figures were suspended. Fate in Cook's honor at Tonga. Fate in Cook's honor at Tonga. Cook, after a stay of 3 months, thought it well to leave these enchanting islands. He distributed a share of the cattle he had bought at the Cape, and explained, through Mai, the way to feed them and their utility. Before leaving, he visited a cemetery or fayatuka, belonging to the king, composed of 3 good-sized houses, placed on the edge of a sort of hill. The planks of these buildings and the artificial hills which supported them were covered with pretty movable pebbles, and flat stones, placed erect, surrounded the whole. One thing which we had not previously seen was that the buildings were open on one side, and within there were 2 wooden busts, roughly carved, one at the entrance and the other a little within. The natives followed us to the door, but dared not pass the threshold. We asked them the meaning of the busts. They assured us that they did not represent any divinity, but were intended to recall 2 chiefs who were buried in the Fayatuka. Leaving Tonga Tabu on the 10th of July, Cook repaired to the Small of Ia, where his old friend Taiwan received him cordially. The captain learned from him that the property of the various islands in the archipelago belonged to the chiefs of Tonga Tabu, which was known as the Land of the Chiefs. Thus Pulaho had 150 islands under his rule. The most important are Vavo and Hamo. As for the Viti Islands, which are comprised in this number, they were inhabited by a warlike race, very superior in intelligence to those of the Friendly Islands. We can only refer to some of the many and interesting particulars collected by the captain and the naturalist Anderson, which relate to the gentleness and docility of the natives. Cook could do nothing but praise the welcome accorded to him, Each time he stayed in the archipelago. But then he did not guess the project entertained by Yao and the other chiefs of assassinating him during the nocturnal Feast of Happy and of seizing his vessels. The navigators who succeeded him were not lavish in their praises, and if we did not know his sincerity, we should be tempted to think that the illustrious mariner gave the name of Friendly Islands to this group satirically. The inhabitants of Tonga Island always mourned the death of a relation by hitting themselves on their cheeks and by tearing them with whales' teeth, a custom which explains the many tumors and cicatrices they have on the face. If their friends are dangerously ill, they sacrifice one or two joints of their little finger to propitiate the divinity, and Cook did not meet with one native in 10 who was not mutilated. The expression taboo, he says, which plays so great a part in the language of this people, has a very wide significance. When they are not allowed to touch anything, they say it is taboo. They also told us that if the king enters a house belonging to one of his subjects, the house becomes taboo, and the owner of it may not live in it any longer. Cook fancied he had made out their religion. Their principal god was Kalifautanga, and in his anger, he destroys plantations and scatters illness and death. The religious ideas of all the islands are not alike, but the immortality of the soul is unanimously admitted. Although they do not offer fruit or other productions of the earth to their divinity, they sacrifice human victims. Cook lost sight of the Tonga Islands on the 17th of July, and the expedition arrived in sight of an island called Tabwai by the inhabitants, upon the 8th of August, after a series of tempestuous winds which caused serious damage to the Discovery. All the eloquence of the English failed to bring the natives on board. Nothing would induce them to leave their boats, and they contented themselves with inviting the strangers to visit them. But as time pressed, and Cook had no need of provisions, he passed the island without stopping, although it appeared to him fertile, and the natives assured him that it abounded in pigs and fowls. Strong, tall, and active, the natives had a hardy and savage appearance. They spoke the Tahitan language, which made intercourse with them easy. Some days later, the verdant summits of Tahiti appeared on the horizon, and the two vessels were not slow in stopping opposite the peninsula of Terrabin, where the welcome Mai received from his compatriots was as indifferent as possible. His brother-in-law, Chief Autai, would scarcely consent to recognize him, but when Mai showed him the treasures he brought back, amongst them all the famous red feathers, which had been so successful in Cook's last voyage, Odie changed his demeanor, treated Mai affably, and proposed to change names with him. Mai was overcome by these demonstrations of tenderness, and, but for Cook's interference, would have been robbed of all his treasures. The ships were well supplied with red feathers. Therefore fruits, pigs, and fowls appeared in great abundance during the stay in port. Cook, however, soon proceeded to Matavai Bay, where King Atu left his residence at Payne, to pay his old friend a visit. Mai was disdainfully received by his friends there also, and although he threw himself at the king's feet, when he presented him with a tuft of red feathers and 3 pieces of gold cloth, he was scarcely noticed. But as at Takaboo, the treatment changed suddenly upon the discovery of Mai's fortune, but he being only happy in the company of vagabonds, who laughed at him good-naturedly, even while they robbed him, was unable to acquire the influence over Atu and the principal chiefs which was necessary to the development of civilization. Cook had long heard that human sacrifices were common in Tahiti, but he had always refused to believe it. A solemn ceremonial which he saw at Adaur no longer allowed him to doubt the existence of the practice. In order to gain the favorable assistance of the Atwa, or Gadan, in an expedition against the island of Imeo, a man of the lowest social rank was killed by blows with clubs in the king's presence. As an offering, the hair and one eye of the victim was placed before the king, last signs of the cannibalism which formerly existed in this archipelago. At the end of this barbarous ceremony, which was a blot in the memoirs of so peaceable a people, a kingfisher alighted in the foliage. "It is Atwa," cried Atu, delighted at the happy augury. Human sacrifice at Tahiti. Human sacrifice at Tahiti. Facsimile of early engraving. Next day the ceremony was to be continued by a holocaust of pigs. The priests, like the Roman augurs, sought to read the history of the expedition in the dying struggles of the victims. Cook, who had silently assisted at the ceremony, could not conceal the horror with which it inspired him. Mai interpreted for him, eloquently and forcibly. Toha could scarcely contain his anger. "If the king had killed a man in England," said Mai, "as he has done the unhappy and innocent victim he has offered to his gods, it would have been impossible to save him from hanging, a punishment reserved for murderers and assassins. My severe reflection was a little out of place. Cook should have remembered that manners vary with countries. It is absurd to attempt to apply to Tahiti, as punishment for that which is their custom, a punishment reserved in London for what is considered a crime. Every man's house is his castle, says a popular proverb, which European nations have too often forgotten. Under the pretext of civilization, they have often shed more blood than would have flowed if they had not interfered. Before he left Tahiti, Cook bestowed all the animals he had had so much difficulty in bringing from Europe upon Atu. They were geese, ducks, turkeys, goats, sheep, horses, and cattle. Adu was at a loss to express his gratitude to the Eric no Praton, King of Britain, especially when he found that the English could not take a large pirogue on board which he had constructed as an offering for his friend the King of England, it being too large. The Resolution and the Discovery left Tahiti on the 30th of September and anchored at Imeo. In this place their stay was marked by a painful incident. Frequent thefts had occurred for several days, when a goat was stolen. To make an example, Cook burnt 5 or 6 cabins and set fire to a large number of pirogues, threatening the king with his anger if the animal were not immediately produced. As soon as he had obtained satisfaction, the captain started for Huahine with Mai, who was to settle on that island. A sufficiently large space of land was ceded by the chiefs of the Wara settlement in return for such presents. Upon this Cook had a house built, and planted a garden, where he planted European cabbages. Mai was left with 2 houses, 2 goats, and fowls. At the same time he was presented with a present of a coat of mail, of a complete set of armor, powder, balls, and guns, a portable organ, an electrical machine, fireworks, and domestic and agricultural implements, completed the collection of useful and ornamental presents, intended to give the Tahitans an idea of European civilization. Mai had a sister married at Huahine, but her husband occupied too humble a position for him to attempt to despoil him. Cook then solemnly declared that the native was his friend, and that in a short time he should return to ascertain how he had been treated, and that he should severely punish those who had acted badly to him. His threats were likely to be effective, as a few days earlier, some robbers, caught in the act by the English, had had their heads shaved and their ears cut. A little later at Raiatea, in order to force the natives to send back some deserters, Cook had carried off the entire family of the chief Oreo on one rope. The moderation exhibited by the captain in his first voyage constantly diminished. Every day he became more severe and exacting. This change in his conduct was fatal to him. The 2 Zealanders who had asked to accompany Mai were landed with him. The elder readily consented to live at Huahine, but the younger conceived such an affection for the English that it was necessary to use force, as it were, to land him, amid the most touching demonstrations of affection. At the last moment as anchor was weighed, Cook bid farewell to Mai, whose expression and tears testified to his comprehension of all he was to lose. Although Cook left satisfied with having loaded the young Tahitan who had trusted himself to him with benefits, he was also full of anxious fears as to his future. He knew his light and inconstant character, and he left him weapons with some regret, fearing that he might make a bad use of them. The king of Huahine gave Mai his daughter in marriage, and changed his name to Paori, by which he was afterwards known. Mai profited by his high station to show his cruelty and inhumanity. Always armed, he began to try his skill with pistol and gun upon his fellow countrymen. His memory, therefore, is hated in Huahine, and the memory of his crimes was for a long time associated with that of the English. Cook visited Raiatea before leaving the island. He found his friend Ori deprived of supreme authority. Then he went to Ballabol on the 8th of December and bought of the King Powney an anchor, which Bougainville had lost in the roadstead. During his long sojourns in the different islands of the Society archipelago, Cook completed his geographical, hydrographical, and ethnological investigations, as well as his studies of natural history. In this difficult task, he was seconded by Anderson, and by his entire staff, who invariably showed the greatest zeal in their efforts for the advancement of science. Tree, from beneath which Cook observed the transit of Venus. Tree, from beneath which Cook observed the transit of Venus. Facsimile of early engraving. On the 24th of December, Cook discovered another low island. It was uninhabited, and the crew obtained abundance of turtle there. It was named Christmas Island, in honor of the solemn anniversary of the morrow. Although 17 months had passed since he left England, Cook considered his voyage as only begun. Indeed, he had not as yet been able to put the part of his instructions relating to the exploration of the southern Atlantic and the search for a North Passage into execution. Captain Cook's chart of Otaheite,